23-year-old Chandler Halderson sat in the Dane County courtroom with the casual demeanor of someone watching a mildly interesting television program rather than a man on trial for the murder and dismemberment of both his parents. Throughout the weeks of testimony, as prosecutors presented photograph after photograph of scattered human remains, as witnesses described the gruesome discoveries that had been made across multiple Wisconsin counties, as the full scope of his monstrous acts was laid bare before judge and jury, Chandler maintained an expression of detached indifference that would become the defining image of his trial. He whispered to his girlfriend during breaks, occasionally smiling at her, as if they were sitting in a coffee shop rather than a courtroom where his life hung in the balance. He studied the crime scene photos with clinical curiosity rather than horror or remorse. And when the evidence became particularly graphic, when the reality of what he had done to the people who had given him life was displayed in unflinching detail, he showed not a flicker of the emotion that any normal human being would feel. This was not the behavior of a man overwhelmed by guilt or struggling with the weight of his actions. This was the behavior of a man who simply did not care, whose capacity for human connection had been replaced by something cold and hollow and terrifying. But for those who had known him, who had watched him construct an elaborate fantasy life built entirely on lies, the emptiness behind his eyes was not a surprise. It was simply the final revelation of who Chandler Halderson had always been beneath the charming surface he presented to the world. The Halderson family had been, by all outward appearances, a portrait of comfortable middle-class success in the suburban landscape of Windsor, Wisconsin. Their home on Waterview Drive was a testament to decades of hard work and careful planning, a spacious residence in a quiet neighborhood where children played in well-maintained yards and neighbors waved to each other on morning walks. Bart Halderson, the family patriarch, was a man whose life had been defined by dedication and reliability. At 50 years old, he had built a career that provided stability and security for his family, earning the respect of colleagues and the trust of those who worked with him. He was the kind of father who showed up to his children's events, who offered guidance without judgment, who believed in second chances, and the power of family to overcome any obstacle. His love for his sons was unconditional, a fact that would be exploited by the very child he trusted most. Krista Halderson, his wife of many years, was equally devoted to her family. At 61, she had spent decades nurturing her children, supporting their dreams, and building a home filled with warmth and encouragement. She was known in the community for her kindness, her willingness to help others, and her unwavering belief in the goodness of her sons. Together, Bart and Krista represented everything that parents aspire to be: supportive, loving, and present in ways that many children never experience. They had no way of knowing that their devotion would be repaid with betrayal of the most terrible kind. Chandler Halderson had grown up in this environment of love and support, enjoying every advantage that caring parents could provide. He was intelligent, charming, and possessed of a confidence that impressed those who met him. From an early age, he demonstrated an ability to navigate social situations with ease, making friends and earning the trust of adults who saw in him the potential for great things. His parents invested in his future, encouraging his interests and providing opportunities that they hoped would lead to success and fulfillment. When he expressed interest in technology and aerospace, they supported his ambitions, proud of their son's lofty goals and confident in his ability to achieve them. They had no reason to doubt him, no indication that the young man they loved was constructing an identity built entirely on fabrication. The lies began small, as such things often do. Minor exaggerations and convenient omissions that allowed Chandler to present himself in the most favorable light. But over time, those small deceptions grew into something far more elaborate, a complete alternate reality in which Chandler Halderson was not an aimless young man struggling to find his place in the world, but a rising star in one of the most prestigious companies on the planet. The centerpiece of Chandler's fantasy life was his claimed employment at SpaceX, the aerospace company founded by Elon Musk that had captured the imagination of a generation with its ambitious goals of space exploration and colonization. According to Chandler, he had secured a position with this elite organization, a job that would take him to exciting places and position him at the cutting edge of human achievement. He spoke of his work with casual confidence, dropping details about projects and colleagues that seemed plausible to parents who had no reason to question their son's honesty. He created fake work emails, fabricated correspondence with supervisors, and constructed an elaborate documentation of a career that existed only in his imagination. When he claimed that his job required him to travel, to work odd hours, to be unavailable at certain times, his parents accepted these explanations without suspicion. They were proud of their son's success, eager to share news of his accomplishments with friends and family who were equally impressed by the young man's achievement. The lie became the foundation of Chandler's existence, a fantasy so thoroughly constructed that it required constant maintenance and elaboration to sustain. But the SpaceX deception was only one layer of the false identity Chandler had created. He also claimed to have earned a college degree, presenting his parents with documentation of academic achievements that he had never actually accomplished. He had attended Madison Area Technical College for a time but had failed to complete his studies, a fact he concealed behind forged transcripts and fabricated graduation ceremonies that he somehow always had a reason for his parents not to attend. The degree was essential to the SpaceX narrative, a prerequisite for the kind of position he claimed to hold. And so it too became part of the elaborate fiction. Each lie required additional lies to support it, a cascading structure of deception that grew more precarious with each passing month. Chandler lived in constant fear of discovery, aware that a single crack in the facade could bring the entire structure crashing down. But rather than confess and face the disappointment of parents who would surely have forgiven him, he chose to burrow deeper into his fantasy, constructing ever more elaborate explanations for the inconsistencies that occasionally arose. His entire identity had become a lie, and the thought of being exposed as a fraud was more terrifying to him than any other outcome he could imagine. The financial implications of Chandler's deceptions were substantial and would eventually become a significant factor in his downfall. Living a double life required resources, money that Chandler did not legitimately possess but needed to maintain the appearance of the successful young professional he claimed to be. He manipulated his parents' trust in various ways, borrowing money for expenses related to his fictional job, requesting assistance with costs that existed only in his imagination, and taking advantage of their generosity in ways they never suspected. The financial drain was gradual but significant, a slow bleeding of resources that Bart and Krista attributed to the normal challenges of supporting an adult child in the expensive early stages of a career. They had no idea that the money they provided was not facilitating their son's professional growth, but rather subsidizing a fantasy that had no connection to reality. As the years passed and the deceptions accumulated, the financial entanglement grew more complex, creating a web of obligations and expectations that Chandler could never legitimately fulfill. The money became another thread in the tapestry of lies, another pressure point that would eventually require more desperate measures to address. The summer of 2021 brought the beginning of the end for Chandler Halderson's elaborate fantasy. The careful structure of lies he had maintained for years was beginning to show cracks that even his considerable skills of manipulation could not conceal. His parents, who had supported him unquestioningly for so long, were beginning to ask questions that had no good answers. The SpaceX job that had seemed so promising had failed to produce the career advancement that should have followed years of employment. The travel opportunities and exciting projects that Chandler described never seemed to materialize into tangible evidence of success. Bart Halderson, whose trust in his son had been unwavering, was starting to notice inconsistencies that troubled him. He began to investigate, to verify the claims that Chandler had made, to seek confirmation of the achievements his son had described. What he found, or rather what he failed to find, raised alarms that could no longer be ignored. There was no record of Chandler's employment at SpaceX. There was no evidence of the degree he claimed to have earned. The entire edifice of his son's adult life appeared to be built on nothing but words and wishes. The confrontation that followed was inevitable, the moment that Chandler had dreaded since the first lie had left his lips. When Bart and Krista sat their son down to demand an explanation for the discrepancies they had discovered, Chandler found himself facing a choice that would define the rest of his existence. He could confess, admit that he had been lying for years, face the disappointment and anger of parents who had sacrificed so much for a son who had repaid them with deception. This path would be painful, humiliating, a complete destruction of the identity he had constructed. But it would also offer the possibility of forgiveness, of rebuilding, of finding a genuine path forward with the support of a family that loved him despite his failures. Or he could choose another path, a darker path that would eliminate the threat of exposure entirely by eliminating the people who posed that threat. In the twisted calculus of Chandler Halderson's mind, the choice was somehow not as difficult as it should have been. The prospect of being revealed as a fraud, of losing the identity he had created, of facing the judgment of a world that had believed his lies was more unbearable than the alternative. And so, in the first week of July 2021, Chandler Halderson made a decision that would transform him from a liar into a murderer. The murders of Bart and Krista Halderson were not impulsive acts of violence committed in the heat of confrontation. They were calculated, premeditated crimes that required planning and execution that spoke to a coldness of purpose that still chills those who contemplate it. Chandler's weapon of choice was a firearm, and he used it to end the lives of both his parents in their own home, the sanctuary that they had built through years of work and sacrifice. The exact sequence of events during those terrible moments remained known fully only to Chandler himself. But the evidence would later reveal that both Bart and Krista met their ends at their son's hands, victims of a child they had loved unconditionally and trusted completely. The betrayal was absolute, a violation of the most fundamental bond that exists between human beings. Parents had died at the hands of their offspring since the beginning of human history. But the cold-blooded nature of these killings, the calculating efficiency with which they were carried out, placed them in a category of horror that even experienced investigators found difficult to process. What followed the murders was perhaps even more disturbing than the killings themselves. A methodical process of disposal that revealed the depths of Chandler's detachment from normal human emotion. He did not panic, did not flee, did not show any of the reactions that might be expected from someone who had just committed the ultimate transgression. Instead, he began the grim work of concealing his crimes, dismembering the bodies of his parents with a clinical efficiency that suggested either prior planning or a capacity for dissociation that bordered on the psychopathic. He scattered their remains across multiple locations in Wisconsin, traveling to remote areas where he believed the evidence of his crimes would never be found. Body parts were discovered in Dane County, in rural areas miles from the family home, hidden in locations that only a local with knowledge of the terrain would have known to use. The dismemberment and dispersal served a practical purpose in Chandler's mind, making identification of the remains more difficult and creating confusion about where the actual crime had occurred. But it also served as a final act of dehumanization, reducing the parents who had loved him to mere problems to be solved, obstacles to be removed and discarded like unwanted garbage. With his parents dead and their remains scattered across the Wisconsin landscape, Chandler Halderson returned to his life as if nothing had happened. The transition from murderer to grieving son was apparently seamless, requiring no adjustment period, no time to compose himself or construct an emotional response to the horror he had committed. On July 7th, 2021, he walked into the Dane County Sheriff's Office and reported his parents missing, expressing concern for their welfare with a convincing display of worried confusion that initially fooled the investigators he encountered. According to Chandler's account, his parents had left for a trip to their cabin on July 1st and had failed to return or make contact since then. He described attempts to reach them by phone, growing concern as the days passed, and finally, the decision to seek help from law enforcement. It was a plausible story, delivered with appropriate emotion, and there was no immediate reason for investigators to suspect that the young man before them was anything other than a son worried about his parents' safety. The missing persons investigation was opened, and the search for Bart and Krista Halderson began. But even as Chandler played the role of the concerned son, investigators began to notice details that did not quite fit the narrative he presented. His affect seemed slightly off, his emotional responses not quite matching the circumstances he described. Experienced detectives develop an instinct for deception, a sensitivity to the subtle cues that distinguish genuine distress from performance, and something about Chandler Halderson triggered that instinct almost immediately. They began to investigate not just the disappearance, but the person reporting it, quietly gathering information about the young man's background and circumstances. What they found was troubling. The SpaceX job that Chandler had described did not exist. The college degree he claimed to have earned was a fabrication. The successful young professional he presented himself as was a fiction, a character in a story that had no connection to reality. The discovery of these lies did not prove that Chandler had harmed his parents, but it established a pattern of deception that transformed him from a worried son into a person of interest whose every statement required verification. The investigation expanded rapidly as more information came to light. Investigators executed search warrants on the Halderson family home, looking for evidence that might explain what had happened to Bart and Krista. What they found was a crime scene that had been cleaned but not thoroughly enough to eliminate all traces of what had occurred there. Forensic technicians discovered evidence of blood in areas of the home, traces that Chandler had failed to completely remove, despite his efforts to sanitize the scene. The evidence suggested that violence had occurred within the house, contradicting Chandler's account of parents who had simply left for a vacation and failed to return. Investigators also examined electronic evidence, phone records, and internet searches that would prove devastating to Chandler's claims of innocence. His own devices revealed searches that no innocent person would have conducted, inquiries about body decomposition, methods of disposal, and other topics that spoke to a guilty mind planning its cover-up. The digital trail that Chandler had left behind became another nail in the coffin of his deception. Evidence that he had not simply stumbled into tragedy, but had anticipated and planned for it. The search for the Haldersons' remains became a massive undertaking that would ultimately span multiple counties and involve dozens of investigators and volunteers. Acting on tips and leads developed through careful detective work, search teams fanned out across rural Wisconsin, combing through forests, fields, and waterways for any sign of the missing couple. The first significant discovery came on July 14th, when remains later identified as belonging to Krista Halderson were found on a property in Dane County. The condition of the remains confirmed what investigators had already begun to suspect, that the Haldersons had not simply disappeared, but had been the victims of violence. Subsequent searches yielded additional remains, body parts scattered across a wide area in what appeared to be a deliberate attempt to prevent identification and confuse the investigation. The discoveries were grim work, requiring investigators to confront the physical evidence of crimes that defied comprehension. Each new find added to the picture of what had happened, building a case that would eventually prove overwhelming. The forensic identification of the remains was a painstaking process that relied on both traditional and advanced techniques. DNA analysis confirmed what the circumstantial evidence had suggested, that the scattered remains belonged to Bart and Krista Halderson. The medical examiner documented the evidence of dismemberment, the tool marks and cut patterns that told the story of how the bodies had been processed after death. This evidence would prove crucial in establishing not just that the Haldersons were dead, but that their deaths had been followed by acts of deliberate concealment that required time, planning, and a complete absence of normal human restraint. The reports generated by the forensic team would become central exhibits in the trial that followed, clinical documentation of horrors that words alone could not adequately convey. Chandler Halderson was arrested on July 15, 2021, just over a week after he had reported his parents missing. The charges were as severe as the evidence warranted: 2 counts of first-degree intentional homicide and 2 counts of mutilating a corpse. He was taken into custody without incident, his demeanor reportedly calm and controlled, even as investigators formally accused him of murdering and dismembering his own parents. The arrest was announced at a press conference that drew significant media attention, the case having already attracted interest due to its disturbing nature and the questions it raised about how a son could commit such acts against the parents who had loved him. The community of Windsor, which had followed the missing persons case with concern and hope, now confronted the horrifying reality that the danger had come from within, that one of their own had committed acts of violence that shattered any illusion of suburban safety. The reaction to Chandler's arrest rippled through the various circles of his life, leaving shock and disbelief in its wake. Friends who had believed his stories of SpaceX success struggled to reconcile the charming young man they knew with the monster now described in news reports. Extended family members grappled with grief for Bart and Krista, alongside the impossible reality that their deaths had come at the hands of their own child. The community of Windsor mourned not just the loss of two respected residents, but the destruction of their sense of security. The revelation that the nice family on Waterview Drive had been harboring a tragedy that no one had seen coming. Vigils were held, memories were shared, and the process of collective grief began. A process that would continue through the months of legal proceedings that lay ahead. Bart and Krista Halderson were remembered as the loving, supportive parents they had been. Their lives celebrated even as the manner of their deaths cast a shadow over everything. In the Dane County Jail, Chandler Halderson awaited trial with the same unsettling calm that had characterized his behavior since his arrest. He met with his court-appointed defense attorneys, participated in the legal process with apparent cooperation, and gave no outward sign of the remorse that might be expected from someone facing the consequences of such terrible crimes. His behavior behind bars was reportedly unremarkable. Neither the desperate denial of an innocent man, nor the tortured guilt of a murderer confronting the weight of his actions. He existed in a kind of emotional limbo, disconnected from the reality of his situation in ways that troubled those who observed him. Psychological evaluations were conducted, experts attempting to understand the mind that had conceived and executed such a calculated betrayal of family trust. The results suggested a personality characterized by narcissism, a grandiose sense of self that could not tolerate the exposure of inadequacy, and a profound deficit in the capacity for empathy that allowed him to view other people, even his own parents, as obstacles rather than human beings with intrinsic value. The pretrial period was consumed by the legal maneuvering that characterizes any major criminal prosecution. The defense explored various strategies, considering challenges to evidence and arguments that might mitigate their client's exposure. But the strength of the prosecution's case was overwhelming. A wall of physical evidence, digital records, and circumstantial proof that left little room for reasonable doubt. The forensic evidence placed the crimes at the Halderson home and linked the scattered remains definitively to Bart and Krista. Chandler's internet searches revealed a consciousness of guilt and evidence of planning that undermined any claim of impulse or accident. His elaborate history of lies provided a motive, the desperate need to prevent the exposure of his deceptions, that made sense of what might otherwise seem senseless. The prosecution, led by experienced attorneys who had handled complex cases before, prepared to present a case that would leave the jury with no choice but conviction. As the trial date approached, the media attention intensified. The case had captured the public imagination in the way that particularly disturbing crimes sometimes do, becoming a topic of discussion on true crime podcasts, social media forums, and news programs across the country. The combination of elements was irresistible to those fascinated by the darker corners of human behavior. There was the elaborate web of lies, a young man who had constructed an entire false identity to avoid the judgment of disappointed parents. There was the brutality of the crimes themselves, not just murder, but dismemberment and dispersal of remains in a calculated attempt to avoid detection. And there was the chilling calm with which Chandler had reported his parents missing, playing the role of worried son while knowing exactly where their remains lay scattered. Each element fed into a narrative of sociopathic detachment that both horrified and fascinated those who followed the case. Chandler Halderson became a symbol, a cautionary tale about the dangers that could lurk behind the most ordinary suburban facades. The prosecution team finalized their strategy in the weeks before trial, organizing the mountain of evidence into a coherent narrative that would guide the jury through the horror of what had happened on Waterview Drive. They prepared witnesses who would testify to the investigation's progression, from the initial missing persons report through the gruesome discoveries and the arrest. They organized forensic experts who would explain the scientific evidence linking Chandler to the crimes. The DNA matches and toolmark analyses that transformed suspicion into proof. They gathered the digital evidence, the damning internet searches, and electronic communications that revealed a guilty mind, and prepared to present it in ways the jury could understand. And they coordinated with members of the Halderson extended family, individuals who would eventually deliver victim impact statements that would put human faces on the crime's toll. The goal was not merely to prove that Chandler Halderson had killed his parents, but to ensure that the jury understood the full scope of his betrayal, the years of lies that had preceded the violence, and the callous disposal of remains that had followed it. The defense faced an impossible task, and everyone involved knew it. The evidence was too strong, the digital trail too damning, the physical proof too conclusive for any reasonable claim of innocence. The defense strategy would therefore focus not on acquittal but on challenging specific aspects of the prosecution's case, creating small doubts that might, perhaps, influence sentencing even if they could not secure a verdict. They would question the reliability of certain forensic techniques, challenge the interpretation of electronic evidence, and attempt to humanize their client in ways that might generate sympathy or at least understanding from jurors who would otherwise see only a monster. It was a difficult brief, requiring attorneys to advocate zealously for a client whose crimes generated visceral revulsion. But such advocacy was the foundation of the legal system, and Chandler's lawyers were prepared to fulfill their ethical obligations regardless of their personal feelings about the man they represented. The community of Windsor settled into a grim anticipation as the trial approached, knowing that the proceedings would reopen wounds that had barely begun to heal. The Halderson family home on Waterview Drive stood as a silent monument to the tragedy, its windows dark, its yard untended, a physical reminder of the lives that had been destroyed within its walls. Neighbors drove past with averted eyes, unable to look at the house without seeing the horror they now knew had occurred there. The normal rhythms of suburban life continued around this void, children going to school, adults going to work, the machinery of everyday existence grinding on despite the darkness that had touched this particular corner of the community. But something had changed in Windsor, a loss of innocence that would never fully recover. The Halderson case had proven that evil could take root anywhere, that the family next door might be harboring secrets too terrible to imagine. It was a lesson no one had wanted to learn, and one that would not be easily forgotten. In the final days before trial, the various participants prepared themselves for what lay ahead. Prosecutors reviewed their evidence and rehearsed their presentations. Defense attorneys finalized their approach and prepared their client for the ordeal to come. Witnesses steeled themselves for the experience of testifying, the challenge of recounting horrors in a public forum while maintaining the composure the legal system required. And somewhere in the Dane County Jail, Chandler Halderson waited, his thoughts and feelings hidden behind the same mask of calm that had characterized his behavior since the beginning. Whatever he felt about the proceedings that would determine his fate, whether fear or resignation or something darker, remained invisible to those around him. He had spent years constructing a false persona to present to the world, and even now, facing the consequences of that deception, he seemed unwilling or unable to reveal what lay beneath the surface. The trial would expose the facts of his crimes, but the deeper truth of who Chandler Halderson really was might remain forever hidden, a mystery that no verdict could fully resolve. The first day of trial arrived with the kind of cold Wisconsin morning that seemed appropriate for the proceedings about to unfold within the walls of the Dane County Courthouse. January 2022 had brought with it bitter temperatures and gray skies, a landscape stripped of warmth that mirrored the emotional tenor of what was to come. The courthouse itself buzzed with an energy that transcended the usual activity of legal business. Reporters and camera crews jostling for position, members of the public lining up for the limited gallery seats, and law enforcement maintaining a visible presence that spoke to the significance of the case about to be tried. The Halderson murders had captured the attention of a nation, and now that attention focused like a laser on the courtroom where Chandler Halderson would face judgment for the deaths of his parents. Inside, the stage was set with the familiar furniture of criminal justice, the judge's bench presiding over the space, the prosecution and defense tables arranged in opposition, the jury box awaiting the 12 citizens who would determine the defendant's fate, and the gallery filling with observers whose reasons for being there ranged from professional obligation to personal grief, to the darker curiosity that draws crowds to scenes of tragedy. Chandler Halderson was led into the courtroom by deputies, his appearance notably different from the disheveled young man who had been arrested 6 months earlier. He wore a suit that someone had selected for him, his hair neatly groomed, his demeanor that of a professional attending a business meeting, rather than a defendant facing 2 counts of first-degree murder. He scanned the gallery as he took his seat at the defense table, his eyes finding his girlfriend among the observers, and a small smile crossed his face, a moment of connection that seemed grotesquely out of place given the circumstances. This girlfriend had stood by him through the months of pre-trial incarceration, visiting him regularly, maintaining the relationship despite the evidence that suggested he had butchered his own parents and scattered their remains across the Wisconsin countryside. Her presence in the gallery would become a recurring element of the trial, a reminder of Chandler's ability to maintain the facade of normalcy even as his crimes were exposed in horrific detail. The bond between them, whatever its nature, represented another audience for whom Chandler felt compelled to perform, another relationship that required the maintenance of the mask he had worn for so long. The jury that would decide Chandler's fate had been selected through a careful process designed to ensure impartiality in a case that had received significant media attention. 12 citizens and several alternates now sat in the jury box, their faces reflecting the seriousness with which they approached their task. They had been questioned extensively about their exposure to pre-trial publicity, their ability to set aside any preconceptions, and their willingness to base their verdict solely on the evidence presented in court. Each had sworn to fulfill this obligation, to listen with open minds, and render judgment according to the law. But as they settled into their seats on that first morning, even the most disciplined among them could not help but steal glances at the young man seated at the defense table, searching his face for some sign of the monster the evidence suggested lurked beneath. What they saw was unsettling in its ordinariness. A clean-cut young man who might have been a neighbor's son, a co-worker's nephew, anyone at all. The banality of his appearance made the charges against him seem almost unbelievable. A disconnect between image and accusation that would be resolved only through the evidence to come. Judge John Hyland called the proceedings to order with the formal gravity that the occasion demanded. A veteran of the Wisconsin bench, Judge Hyland had presided over difficult cases before, but the Halderson matter represented a particular challenge, requiring the careful management of emotional testimony and graphic evidence while ensuring that the defendant received the fair trial to which he was constitutionally entitled. His instructions to the jury were thorough, explaining the burden of proof, the presumption of innocence, and the requirement that their verdict be based solely on what they heard and saw in the courtroom. He reminded them that opening statements were not evidence, that the arguments of attorneys were meant to guide but not replace their own evaluation of the facts. And he warned them that some of the evidence they would encounter would be disturbing, urging them to approach such material with the clinical detachment necessary to render a fair judgment. His words were the traditional preamble to criminal proceedings, but they carried additional weight given the nature of the crimes at issue. This was not a case that would allow emotional distance, no matter how earnestly the judge urged it. The prosecution's opening statement was delivered by Assistant District Attorney William Brown, a prosecutor whose years of experience had prepared him for the challenge of presenting a case this disturbing in a manner that was both compelling and controlled. He rose from his chair and approached the jury with the quiet confidence of a man who knew his evidence was overwhelming, who understood that his task was less to persuade than to organize, to present the facts in a sequence that would lead inevitably to the only possible conclusion. He began not with the crimes themselves, but with the lies that had preceded them, painting a portrait of a young man whose entire adult identity had been constructed on a foundation of deception. He described the fake SpaceX job, the forged academic credentials, the years of manipulation that had exploited the trust of loving parents who wanted nothing more than to see their son succeed. He spoke of Bart and Krista Halderson as the devoted parents they had been, Victims not just of violence, but of a betrayal that had been building for years without their knowledge. His tone was measured, but his words were devastating, establishing the context that would make the crimes themselves comprehensible as the desperate acts of a man whose lies were about to be exposed. When Brown turned to the events of July 2021, his presentation became more clinical, more focused on the evidence that would prove what had occurred in the Halderson home. He described the timeline that investigators had reconstructed: the last confirmed contacts with Bart and Krista, the absence of any evidence that they had ever left for the vacation their son claimed they had taken. End quote. He outlined the physical evidence recovered from the home, the traces of blood that cleaning had failed to eliminate, the forensic indicators of violence that contradicted Chandler's story of parents who had simply disappeared. He previewed the digital evidence, the internet searches that revealed a guilty mind contemplating disposal of remains, the electronic footprints that placed Chandler at locations where his parents' body parts would later be discovered. And he described the remains themselves, the scattered pieces of human beings who had once been a loving mother and father, reduced by their son to problems requiring disposal. His voice remained steady throughout, but the facts he recited needed no dramatic enhancement. The horror spoke for itself. The defense opening was delivered by public defender Catherine Dorrell, an experienced attorney whose assignment to this case represented one of the most challenging briefs of her career. She faced a jury that had just heard a damning summary of evidence, and her task was to create doubt where little seemed to exist. Her approach was careful, acknowledging the tragedy that had occurred while challenging the prosecution's narrative at specific points. She reminded the jury that opening statements were not evidence, that the prosecution's claims would need to be proven through witnesses and exhibits that could be challenged and questioned. She suggested that the investigation had been flawed in certain respects, that assumptions had been made that deserved scrutiny, that the rush to judgment against her client had potentially overlooked alternative explanations. Her arguments were technical rather than emotional, focusing on the process of investigation rather than the question of guilt, perhaps recognizing that any attempt to generate sympathy for Chandler would fall flat, given what the jury would soon see and hear. She concluded by reminding the jurors of their obligation to hold the prosecution to its burden, to require proof beyond reasonable doubt before rendering a verdict. It was a competent, if uninspired, opening, the best that could be offered in a case where the evidence left little room for reasonable dispute. The prosecution began its presentation of evidence with the testimony of the investigators who had handled the case from its beginning. The first witness was the deputy who had taken Chandler's initial missing persons report, describing the young man's demeanor when he came to the sheriff's office, claiming concern for his parents' welfare. The deputy's account was matter-of-fact, professional, but certain details stood out. Chandler had seemed appropriately worried, the deputy noted. But something about his presentation had triggered instincts developed through years of dealing with people in crisis. There was a quality of performance to his concern, a sense that the emotions being displayed were calculated rather than genuine. These impressions had not been enough to trigger immediate suspicion, but they had lodged in the deputy's mind, returning with greater significance as the investigation progressed. Under cross-examination, the defense attempted to characterize these impressions as subjective and unreliable, noting that grief manifests differently in different people, but the seed had been planted. The first suggestion that Chandler's behavior from the very beginning had contained the telltale signs of deception. Subsequent witnesses built the investigative narrative. Testimony by testimony. Detectives described the progression of their inquiry, from routine missing persons procedures to the dawning suspicion that something far darker had occurred. They recounted the discovery of Chandler's lies about his employment and education, the moment when the concerned son became a person of interest. They described the execution of search warrants, the examination of the Halderson home that had revealed evidence inconsistent with the story Chandler had told. Technical witnesses explained the forensic processes that had been employed, the collection and analysis of physical evidence that would prove central to the case. The testimony was methodical, building block by building block, constructing a foundation of fact that would support the more dramatic evidence to come. Through it all, Chandler sat at the defense table with an expression of distant interest, following the testimony as if it concerned someone else entirely, occasionally leaning over to whisper to his attorneys or exchange glances with his girlfriend in the gallery. The presentation of the crime scene evidence marked a shift in the emotional temperature of the courtroom. Photographs of the Halderson home were displayed, images that documented the evidence of violence that Chandler's cleanup efforts had failed to eliminate. Blood traces were highlighted, their locations indicating areas where deadly force had been employed. The images showed a home that had been the scene of horror, walls and floors that had absorbed evidence of the betrayal that had occurred within them. Several jurors visibly reacted to these photographs, their faces tightening as the reality of what had happened became tangible through visual evidence. But Chandler's reaction was notably absent. He studied the photographs with the detachment of someone reviewing real estate listings, showing no emotional connection to images of his childhood home transformed into a crime scene. His composure during this portion of the testimony was noted by observers, adding to the impression of a defendant fundamentally disconnected from normal human emotional responses. The forensic testimony that followed was technical but devastating. DNA analysts explained the testing that had linked the blood found in the home to Bart and Krista Halderson, the genetic matching that established beyond any scientific doubt whose blood had been spilled on those floors and walls. Experts described the analysis of tool marks found on the recovered remains, the patterns consistent with dismemberment by specific types of implements. Medical examiners testified to the condition of the remains when recovered, the evidence of deliberate mutilation that had been necessary to divide human bodies into the pieces that had been scattered across multiple locations. This testimony was necessarily graphic, requiring descriptions that pushed against the limits of what could be spoken aloud in a legal proceeding. Jurors who had maintained their composure during earlier testimony now struggled visibly, some averting their eyes, others gripping the arms of their chairs. The clinical language of forensic science could not fully sanitize the horror being described. The transformation of parents into scattered remains by a son who had once been the focus of their love and hope. It was during this forensic testimony that Chandler's behavior drew particular attention, becoming a story within the story that would dominate coverage of the trial. As photographs of his mother's remains were displayed on the courtroom screens, Chandler's gaze wandered to the gallery, finding his girlfriend and offering her a small smile. The moment was captured by courtroom observers and quickly circulated through media covering the trial. The contrast was stark and disturbing. Images of dismembered human beings on display, while the man accused of creating those images shared affectionate glances with his romantic partner. It was not the behavior of a man overwhelmed by guilt or struggling with the weight of terrible accusations. It was the behavior of someone for whom the proceedings were an inconvenience, rather than a reckoning. A young man so disconnected from the reality of what he had done that he could smile while the evidence of his crimes was displayed for all to see. The image of Chandler smirking at his girlfriend during graphic testimony became iconic, a visual representation of the sociopathic detachment that had allowed him to commit such terrible acts. The digital evidence presented by the prosecution was equally damning, revealing a pattern of internet activity that spoke to premeditation and consciousness of guilt. Forensic analysts testified to searches recovered from Chandler's devices, inquiries about body decomposition, techniques for disposing of remains, and other topics that no innocent person would have reason to explore. The timing of these searches was significant, occurring in the days before and after the murders, in a pattern consistent with someone planning and then executing a crime. Chandler had researched how long it took for bodies to decompose, how to clean blood from various surfaces, and how to avoid detection while transporting biological material. The digital trail was comprehensive and devastating, a window into a mind that had contemplated murder as a solution to problems and had methodically researched how to carry it out. The defense challenged the interpretation of this evidence, suggesting that curiosity was not proof of guilt, but the argument fell flat against the context in which these searches had occurred. Chandler had not been researching for a school project or exploring a morbid interest. He had been planning the murder of his parents. The testimony regarding the discovery of remains was among the most emotionally difficult of the trial, requiring witnesses to describe scenes that still haunted their memories months later. Search team members recounted the moment when their efforts yielded results, the discovery of human remains in locations scattered across rural Wisconsin. One witness described finding what was later identified as part of Krista Halderson's body, the moment of recognition that the search for a missing couple had become a recovery operation for murder victims. Another witness testified about a secondary location where additional remains were discovered, the grim expansion of a search that seemed to have no end. The testimony painted a picture of deliberate dispersal, a calculated effort to prevent identification and confuse investigators by spreading remains across such a wide area that they might never all be recovered. Each discovery represented another piece of evidence, another link in the chain connecting Chandler to crimes he continued to deny. And each discovery represented another wound to those who loved Bart and Krista, who were forced to contemplate the final indignity their family members had suffered at the hands of their own son. The prosecution's case continued with testimony that established Chandler's presence at locations where remains had been discovered. Cell phone records and surveillance footage placed him in areas miles from his home, at times when he claimed to have been elsewhere, in patterns consistent with someone transporting and disposing of evidence. A property owner testified that Chandler had access to land where remains were found, having visited under pretenses that now appeared far more sinister in retrospect. Witnesses described seeing vehicles matching descriptions of cars to which Chandler had access in locations that would later become significant to the investigation. The circumstantial evidence accumulated like snowflakes in a blizzard, each piece individually minor, but collectively overwhelming. Chandler had been where the remains were found. He had the opportunity, the access, and the means. Combined with the forensic evidence linking him to the crimes and the digital evidence revealing his guilty mind, the prosecution's case had become a fortress with no apparent weak points. Throughout this presentation, the defense offered cross-examinations that challenged specific details without seriously threatening the overall narrative. Defense attorneys questioned the precision of cell tower data, suggested alternative interpretations of surveillance footage, and probed the methodology of forensic analyses. These challenges were competent legal work, the kind of detail-oriented scrutiny that the adversarial system requires, but they failed to create the reasonable doubt that would be necessary for acquittal. The evidence was simply too comprehensive, too consistent, too mutually reinforcing to be dismissed through attacks on individual elements. For every question the defense raised, the prosecution had an answer that fit within their overall theory of the case. Chandler had killed his parents to prevent the exposure of his lies. He had dismembered their bodies to facilitate disposal and avoid detection. He had scattered their remains across multiple counties in a calculated attempt to escape justice. And he had walked into the sheriff's office to report them missing, playing the role of worried son while knowing exactly what had happened to them. When the prosecution rested its case, the evidence before the jury was overwhelming. The physical proof, the digital trail, the timeline of events, and the pattern of lies all pointed to a single, inescapable conclusion. But legal proceedings require more than evidence. They require the formal completion of adversarial process, the opportunity for the defense to present its own case and challenge the prosecution's narrative. The defense, despite the mountain of evidence arrayed against them, was obligated to advocate for their client, to explore any avenue that might create doubt or mitigate consequences. Their case, such as it was, focused less on innocence than on challenging the prosecution's ability to prove every element beyond reasonable doubt. They called no witnesses who could provide an alibi, produced no evidence that pointed to alternative suspects, offered no theory of the case that explained away the damning facts that had been established. Their strategy was one of attrition, hoping that accumulated challenges to specific pieces of evidence might somehow coalesce into the reasonable doubt that would save their client from conviction. The defense did present testimony from mental health experts who had evaluated Chandler, professionals who offered perspectives on his psychological makeup that were meant to provide context, if not excuse. These experts described a personality characterized by narcissistic traits, An inflated sense of self-importance, combined with a fragile ego that could not tolerate failure or exposure. They spoke of the web of lies that Chandler had constructed as a maladaptive coping mechanism, a defense against the shame of being ordinary in a world that had expected him to be exceptional. They suggested that the murders, while not excusable, might be understood as the desperate act of someone whose entire identity was about to collapse, a psychological implosion that had resulted in violence. The prosecution challenged these characterizations on cross-examination, noting that millions of people experience failure without resorting to murder, that narcissism explained behavior but did not excuse it, that understanding motive was not the same as accepting justification. The expert testimony added dimension to the portrait of Chandler Halderson but did little to undermine the fundamental question of whether he had committed the crimes charged. Chandler himself did not testify, a decision that was legally sound given the overwhelming evidence against him. His silence meant that the jury would never hear his voice explaining what had happened, never have the opportunity to assess his credibility under the pressure of cross-examination. But his demeanor throughout the trial had communicated more effectively than any testimony could have. Day after day, he had sat at the defense table with the calm detachment of someone fundamentally unconcerned with the proceedings, occasionally smiling at his girlfriend, whispering to his attorneys during graphic testimony, showing no visible reaction to evidence of the murders he had committed. His behavior had become its own form of testimony, a nonverbal confession of the emptiness that lay at his core. Jurors who had watched him throughout the trial had formed impressions that no closing argument could alter. Perceptions of a young man whose soul appeared to be missing, who could sit through the recitation of his crimes against his own parents without a flicker of genuine emotion. The closing arguments offered each side a final opportunity to frame the evidence for the jury. The prosecution's closing was a methodical summary of the case, walking jurors through the evidence piece by piece, connecting the dots that led inevitably to Chandler's guilt. Prosecutor Brown spoke of the lies that had consumed Chandler's life, the false identity that had required constant maintenance and that had finally collapsed under the weight of parental scrutiny. He described the choice that Chandler had faced when exposure seemed imminent, the crossroads where he might have chosen confession and faced disappointment, or chosen violence and faced destruction. He had chosen violence, Brown reminded the jury. Not in a moment of passion, but through premeditation and planning, researching methods of disposal before carrying out the murders that would require such disposal. And he had executed his plan with a coldness that still chilled those who contemplated it. Dismembering the bodies of his parents and scattering their remains like garbage across the Wisconsin landscape. The evidence was overwhelming, Brown concluded, and justice required a verdict of guilty on all counts. The defense closing was a final attempt to create doubt where none reasonably existed. Defense attorney Dorrell reminded the jury of their obligation to require proof beyond reasonable doubt, suggesting that the prosecution's case, while compelling in its overall narrative, contained gaps and uncertainties that should give them pause. She challenged specific pieces of evidence, questioned the reliability of certain forensic techniques, and suggested that the investigation had been influenced by premature conclusions about her client's guilt. Her argument was technically competent but emotionally hollow, the best that could be offered in a case where the evidence left little room for genuine dispute. She asked the jurors to remember that the defendant was a human being, a young man whose life hung in the balance, entitled to the benefit of every reasonable doubt. But as she spoke, the jurors' eyes drifted to Chandler, to the composed figure at the defense table, whose behavior throughout the trial had already answered the question of his humanity in ways that no argument could alter. The jury deliberated for approximately 2 hours before returning with their verdict, a duration that spoke to the overwhelming nature of the evidence, rather than any serious disagreement about its meaning. When the foreman announced the verdict, guilty on both counts of first-degree intentional homicide and guilty on both counts of mutilating a corpse, the courtroom received the news with quiet acknowledgement rather than surprise. The evidence had pointed to only one conclusion, and the jury had reached it with appropriate speed. Chandler received the verdict with the same unsettling calm that had characterized his demeanor throughout the proceedings. No visible reaction, no expression of despair or relief, just the flat affect of someone disconnected from the reality of what was happening to him. His girlfriend in the gallery broke into tears, one of the few displays of genuine emotion associated with the defendant throughout the entire process. The family members of Bart and Krista, who had attended portions of the trial and would return for sentencing, received the verdict as a validation of what they had known from the beginning, that the young man they had watched grow up had destroyed the people who had given him life. The sentencing hearing convened several weeks after the verdict, allowing time for the preparation of pre-sentence reports and the arrangement of victim impact statements. The courtroom was again packed, the community recognizing that this final phase of the proceedings would determine what form justice would take for the Halderson murders. Judge Hyland presided with the same careful gravity he had brought to the trial itself, aware that the sentence he would impose would need to reflect both the severity of the crimes and the values of a society that demanded accountability for such terrible acts. The prosecution prepared to argue for the maximum sentence, life without the possibility of parole on each murder count, consequences that would ensure Chandler Halderson never again walked free among potential victims. The defense prepared their mitigation arguments, seeking any reduction in severity that might offer their client some distant hope of eventual release. Both sides understood that the sentencing would be the final chapter of this legal proceeding, the moment when words would translate into years and decades of consequence. The victim impact statements were delivered by members of the extended Halderson family, individuals who had lost siblings, in-laws, and relatives to Chandler's violence. Their words painted a picture of Bart and Krista that transcended their status as victims, restoring to them the humanity that their son's crimes had attempted to erase. Speakers remembered Bart as a devoted father and husband, a man whose greatest joy had been watching his sons grow and succeed, whose final betrayal had come at the hands of the child he had loved most. They remembered Krista as the heart of the family, a woman whose warmth and kindness had touched everyone who knew her, whose life had been dedicated to nurturing the potential she saw in those around her. They spoke of holidays that would never be the same, of family gatherings that now contained an absence that could never be filled, of the ordinary moments of family life that had been permanently poisoned by the knowledge of how Bart and Krista had died. Their words were raw with grief, but also burning with anger. The righteous fury of people who had witnessed an unforgivable betrayal and demanded the fullest measure of justice in response. One speaker addressed Chandler directly, breaking the formal distance that typically characterized such statements to confront the defendant with the pain he had caused. The speaker recounted memories of Chandler as a child, the family gatherings where he had seemed like any other kid, the gradual transformation into someone none of them had recognized until it was too late. They challenged the mask of indifference that Chandler continued to wear, demanding to know if any human feeling remained behind those empty eyes, if any part of him understood the devastation he had wrought. Chandler met this challenge with the same flat affect he had maintained throughout, offering no response, showing no sign that the words had penetrated whatever armor protected him from normal human emotion. The speaker concluded with a statement that captured the frustration and sorrow of everyone who had known the Haldersons, expressing the painful truth that no sentence could ever be adequate to the crime, that justice in any ultimate sense was impossible, but that the closest approximation to justice was ensuring that Chandler never had the opportunity to harm anyone else. Judge Hyland's sentencing statement was a carefully crafted reflection on the crime, the defendant, and the demands of justice. He began by acknowledging the tragedy that had brought everyone to this courtroom, the loss of 2 lives that had been valuable to their family, their community, and the world. He spoke of Bart and Krista Halderson as the loving parents they had been, victims of a betrayal so complete that it challenged comprehension. He noted that the evidence presented at trial had revealed not just the mechanics of murder, but the psychology of a defendant whose capacity for deception extended to the destruction of those who had given him everything. He addressed Chandler directly, his words measured but carrying an undertone of the contempt that anyone confronting such crimes would naturally feel. He noted that throughout the proceedings, through the presentation of evidence and the testimony of witnesses, Chandler had shown no genuine remorse, no acknowledgement of the suffering he had caused, no connection to the moral weight of what he had done. This absence of remorse, the judge observed, was perhaps the most troubling aspect of the case, suggesting a defendant who was not merely guilty but incapable of the self-reflection that might make rehabilitation possible. When Judge Hyland pronounced the sentence, his voice carried the weight of finality that such moments demand. For the first-degree intentional homicide of Bart Halderson, life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the first-degree intentional homicide of Krista Halderson, life in prison without the possibility of parole. For each count of mutilating a corpse, additional years that would be served consecutively, ensuring that even if some future legal development affected the murder convictions, Chandler would remain incarcerated for decades. The sentences reflected the maximum available under law, a statement by the court and by society that crimes of this magnitude demanded consequences of corresponding severity. There would be no opportunity for parole, no chance at early release, no possibility that Chandler Halderson would ever again walk free among potential victims. He would grow old behind prison walls, his life reduced to the routines of institutional existence, his future extinguished by the same choice that had extinguished the lives of his parents. Chandler's reaction to the sentence was watched closely by everyone in the courtroom, observers searching for any sign that the reality of his situation was finally penetrating his defenses. For a moment, something flickered across his face, a tightening of the jaw, a narrowing of the eyes, a crack in the composed facade he had maintained throughout. Whether it was fear, anger, or simply the physical reaction to finally confronting the permanence of his fate was impossible to determine. But it was gone almost as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the familiar blankness that had become his signature. He was led from the courtroom by deputies, his movements slow and mechanical, his eyes focused on some middle distance that contained whatever thoughts occupied his mind at that moment. His girlfriend watched him go, her tears flowing freely. Perhaps only now, fully comprehending that the man she had stood by was never coming back, that their relationship had been with someone who existed primarily in her own imagination. The door closed behind him, a symbolic period at the end of a sentence that would last the remainder of his natural life. In the aftermath of the trial, the community of Windsor began the slow process of healing that such tragedies require. The Halderson home on Waterview Drive was eventually sold, purchased by new owners who would never fully escape the shadow of what had occurred within its walls. Neighbors who had lived through the horror of discovery gradually returned to normal routines, though normal itself had been permanently altered by what they had witnessed. The schools that had educated Chandler and his brother implemented new programs focused on mental health and intervention, hoping to identify warning signs in students before they could progress to tragedy. Memorials were held for Bart and Krista, celebrations of their lives that attempted to reclaim their memory from the manner of their deaths. The community pulled together in the way that communities do, finding strength in shared sorrow and shared determination to prevent such things from happening again. The Halderson case became a subject of study and discussion in circles ranging from legal education to true crime entertainment. Lawyers analyzed the evidence and the trial strategy, drawing lessons about investigation and prosecution of complex cases. Psychologists examined Chandler's behavior and background, searching for the factors that had produced such a complete absence of moral restraint. True crime enthusiasts dissected every detail, their fascination with the case sometimes crossing into the exploitative territory that troubled those who had lived through it. The case was featured in documentaries, podcasts, and news programs, the story of a young man who had constructed an elaborate fantasy life and destroyed his parents when that fantasy threatened to collapse. Each retelling emphasized different elements, some focusing on the lies, others on the violence, others on the psychological mysteries that remained even after the legal questions had been resolved. Chandler Halderson became, like other notorious killers before him, a reference point in discussions of familial violence and the hidden dangers that could lurk behind the most ordinary facades. For the extended Halderson family, the end of the trial was not the end of their ordeal. Grief does not operate on legal timelines, and the verdict and sentence that brought one kind of closure also marked the beginning of a different kind of reckoning. Family members faced the challenge of preserving the memory of Bart and Krista while somehow processing the reality of who had killed them. They grappled with questions that could never be fully answered, wondering if they had missed signs, if they could have intervened, if the tragedy might somehow have been prevented. They rebuilt family traditions around absences that could never be filled, gathered for holidays that were shadowed by those who should have been present. Some found solace in faith, others in community, others in the determination to honor Bart and Krista by living fully the lives that had been stolen from them. The journey was individual for each family member, but they traveled it together, bound by a shared loss that no outsider could fully understand. Chandler Halderson was transferred to the Wisconsin State Prison System, beginning a sentence that would end only with his death. The young man who had fantasized about a career at SpaceX now faced a future of institutional routine, of cells and yards and the grinding monotony of incarcerated existence. Whatever thoughts occupied his mind as he adjusted to this reality remained his alone, hidden behind the same mask of indifference that had characterized his courtroom demeanor. Prison psychologists would continue to evaluate him, to probe for signs of the empathy and remorse that had been so conspicuously absent. Some would attempt rehabilitation, operating on the hope that even the most damaged psyche might be capable of change. Others would focus on management, on ensuring that he did not present a danger to fellow inmates or staff. Chandler would age within those walls, watching the world change through the narrow window of prison life. Growing from young man to middle-aged to elderly, his life a cautionary tale that would be told to new generations who would know him only as a symbol of betrayal and violence. The legacy of the Halderson case extended beyond the immediate tragedy, raising questions about parenting, about the nature of deception, and about the warning signs that might have been recognized before disaster struck. Parents who followed the case hugged their children a little tighter, newly aware of the gap that could exist between the child they thought they knew and the person that child had actually become. Educators discussed strategies for identifying and addressing the kind of pathological lying that had characterized Chandler's adult life, recognizing that intervention might be possible before deception escalated to violence. Mental health professionals analyzed the psychological factors that could produce such a complete absence of conscience, searching for ways to identify and treat such conditions before they manifested in harm. The case became a reference point, a cautionary tale that illustrated the devastating consequences when the pressure of maintained deception finally became unbearable. In his cell, surrounded by the bare walls of institutional existence, Chandler Halderson faced the reality that his lies had created. The fantasy of SpaceX success, the imagined career and accomplishments that had sustained his self-image, had collapsed into this final truth: a convicted murderer serving a sentence that would consume the remainder of his life. Whatever he had hoped to achieve through his crimes, whatever future he had imagined might emerge from the elimination of his parents, had been replaced by this ending that was no ending, this continuation of existence without purpose or hope. He would have decades to contemplate what he had done, years stretching out before him, in which the weight of his actions might finally penetrate the defenses that had protected him from remorse. Or perhaps those defenses would hold forever, leaving him encased in the same emotional void that had allowed him to smile at his girlfriend while the evidence of his crimes was displayed before the court. Either way, his story had reached its conclusion. The final chapter, written by a judge whose words had sealed his fate as surely as his own actions had sealed his parents. And in the memories of those who had known them, Bart and Krista Halderson lived on. They survived in the stories told by family members at gatherings, in the photographs displayed in homes across Wisconsin, in the impact they had made on everyone whose lives they had touched. They were remembered as the parents they had been, not as the victims they had become. Their lives celebrated even as the manner of their deaths cast a permanent shadow. Their legacy was not the violence that had ended their lives, but the love they had given and received, the relationships they had nurtured, the difference they had made in a world that was poorer for their absence. In that remembrance, there was a kind of victory over the son who had tried to erase them, a triumph of memory over oblivion, of love over hate, of the human connections that Chandler had been incapable of forming or understanding. Bart and Krista Halderson would be remembered. And in that remembrance, there was meaning that transcended the horror of their ending.